Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Priority-Based Planning in D365 Supply Chain Management. My name is David, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by other session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you're agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout the broadcast and during the Q&A segment near the end. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Anne Krupke, Senior Program Manager. Anne, over to you.
Thanks, David. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Anne Krupke, and I will be presenting today on the new priority-based planning feature in D365 Supply Chain Management. With me today, I have Aaron Murch and Zach Greenvoss from the D365 Fast Track team to help answer questions, as well as Christian Ritt from the Dynamics product team. They'll be helping to answer questions in the chat, which please feel free to ask as we go through. In today's session, we'll cover an introduction of what priority-based planning is. This feature was recently announced at Ignite as a new feature in D365. We will go through the steps needed to set up priority-based planning in the system, and then we'll deep dive into the different priority calculation methods that are available and walk through some scenarios to help drive home what some of the potential applications of this feature are. Once we're through with that, we will cover some side notes to keep in mind when you're testing or implementing this functionality, and then we will have some additional time at the end for questions and answers. This Tech Talk assumes that attendees are familiar with the basics of traditional master planning. So this is more of a 200-level Tech Talk where we'll be diving deeper into the nitty-gritties of what this functionality does and how it's different from traditional master planning. So please keep that in mind. Not all demand is created equal. The scenario that I have on the slide today will be the baseline that we use to discuss the different ways we can leverage priority-based planning to let us take a more resilient approach to demand fulfillment. In this scenario, we have a main warehouse, 13, that has 650 units on hand. We have 2 warehouses, store warehouses, 11 and 12, which have 450 units on hand and 120 units on hand and need replenishment. We also have a sales order, and we also have a demand forecast. This is an example where we're seeing more often today that our supply chains can't keep up with all the changes in our world, and we don't always have enough inventory to allocate across all of our sources of demand. So with traditional master planning, when we have not enough inventory to cover demand, the only way that we really prioritize today is by requirement date. So when everything is needed to go on the same day, traditional master planning throws up a flag and tells me as a planner that I have to decide where things are going to go. Priority-based planning is here to help us determine what is the order in which we should allocate our inventory across different sources of demand, especially when we don't have enough inventory on hand. The business value that we can find here is increased service levels, lower buffer inventory levels needed, and optimizing supply chain by using this functionality to drive inventory where it is needed the most. We're going to keep coming back to this scenario and talking about the different ways that we can apply priority-based master planning to drive our inventory across our different sources of demand. So let's dive into some of the different features of this functionality. The first way that we can begin to prioritize our demand and our supply is by order type. When we're talking about the prioritization of different order lines in D365, the priorities range in value from 0 to 100, with 0 being the highest priority. With priority-based planning, I can assign a default priority for each different type of order that I can have in the system. For example, I may decide that I want to prioritize sales orders over demand forecast, and I can assign my sales orders a default priority of 5 and my demand forecast a default priority of 60, for example. Purchase orders can also be assigned a planning priority so that both internal and external vendors can be advised of our order priorities. Transfer orders as well have order priorities, which can drive both the allocation of inventory and can be used as a communication tool in the case, for example, that we're using a 3PL to do our inventory movements. But what if we need to go a level further, especially when we look at restocking warehouses in this transfer order or purchase order scenario? Are all replenishment transfers valued at the same priority? What if we want to differentiate between an emergency restock and a standard refill? This is a topic that we're going to spend the majority of this conversation talking about, the different ways we can prioritize that kind of replenishment demand. But before we go into that, I want to take a minute to talk about supply priority, since we'll be focusing more on demand priority through the rest of this presentation. Supply is assigned a priority just like demand. And when we run priority-based planning, master planning will peg supply against demand, starting with the supply with the highest priority. On-hand inventory is going to be provided a priority of 0, which means on-hand inventory will be allocated prior to any of our planned orders or existing purchase orders or supply orders. We also have the ability with this functionality to consider demand priority when we're calculating supply priority. What this means is the demand if I have demand with a higher priority and I have a corresponding supply order, then I want that supply order to have a higher priority as well, which will translate our priority throughout the supply chain. So now we're going to take a step over into D365 and go over the steps required to set up this functionality in the system. This feature was previewed in 10.0.21 and will be generally available in February of 2022. The first thing that we need to do is to enable the feature priority-driven MRP support for planning optimization, which is available through the feature management workspace. Then we will create planning priority models. We will create priority coverage groups and assign those priority models. And then we will set up item coverage where we're going to use our minimum, maximum, and reorder points to drive the deeper priority calculation for warehouse replenishments. With that, I'm going to switch over to D365. I've already enabled the feature in the feature management workspace, so we're not going to cover that again. We'll start by going to the master planning module and setting up a priority planning model. So in the master planning module, as part of this functionality, we have a new menu item called planning priority models. Planning priority models are the tool that we'll use to calculate what the priority for supply and demand for particular items using that model will be. In the planning priority model, we define the priority calculation method, our options for which are priority ranges and % of maximum inventory quantity. We're going to talk in some more detail later on what the difference between those two things are and why you might choose one over the other. When we're using priority ranges, we also have an option to determine our planned order creation strategy. Our options for that are single supply with the most important priority and split according to priority ranges. Again, this is something we're going to dig into. What does that really mean a little bit further on? When we are using priority ranges, that's when we can use the flag consider demand priority when calculating the priority of a supply order, which we referenced just a couple minutes ago. When we have priority ranges as our calculation method, this tab called Planning Priority Ranges is where we use to determine what our ranges are going to be and what the corresponding priorities are. Finally, the other piece of information that we use a planning priority model to determine is our planning priority defaults for different order types. You can see here, I'm set my sales order default at a priority of 5 because I want to prioritize, personally, I want to prioritize sales orders over the vast majority of other types of orders. I can also set my purchase order default, my transfer order default, and my demand forecast default in this way. I have set up 3 different priority models as an example, but the number of priority models that may be right for your business will be dependent on the different types of categorizations that you have on your items and the different ways you want them to behave. Once we've created our planning priority models, we need to create coverage groups. As part of this functionality that was released, there is a new coverage code available. It's called priority. So when we want to use priority-based planning, we need to create a coverage group and select the coverage code priority for this functionality to work. Once we've done that, we will be able to assign the corresponding planning priority model that this coverage group will use when we're running priority-based planning. So I can select from the dropdown from the list of planning priority models that I've created in my system. And lastly, the other piece of information that we will want to set up is what our minimum, our maximum, and our reorder points are for items that we're going to use planning priority on. In this case, we'll go to our item coverage. You can see here that I've set the system up to reflect the scenario that we covered at the beginning. For example, on warehouse 11, I've set up my minimum of 200, my reorder point of 500, and my maximum of 1,000. Reorder point is a field that is new as well as part of this functionality, and the minimum and the maximum are the fields that have existed today. So those are the 3 key pieces to set up when we are setting up priority-based planning in D365. Just to recap, we set up planning priority models. These are used to determine what the calculated value of priority will be for different supply and demand orders, and they will be associated with coverage groups with coverage type priority. We also set minimum, maximum, and reorder points on our specific warehouses on an item level. Master planning, when we use priority-based planning, will generate replenishment requirements when the POH or projected on-hand inventory is below the reorder point. So with traditional master planning and a minimum and a maximum, the way that the system works is when we run master planning and the projected on-hand inventory is below the minimum, that triggers us to order up to the maximum. By adding a reorder point, we can have the minimum be our true safety stock minimum that we will really not want to go below. The reorder point tells us when we need to place the order, and the maximum is the inventory we've reordered to. The reorder point typically is calculated as the minimum plus the expected demand that will be forecasted during the replenishment lead time. So in the example we have here, my minimum is 200. My lead time is 6 days, and I expect to have a demand of 300 units in the 6 days that it will take me to replenish my warehouse. So in this case, my reorder point becomes 200 plus 300, which is 500. Now let's dive deeper into the prioritization methods that are available, which we saw when we were setting up the planning priority models. The first method is to prioritize by % of maximum inventory. So taking this example that we covered at the beginning, where my warehouses have a minimum of 200, a reorder point of 500, and a maximum of 1,000. Prioritization by percent of maximum inventory will take the projected on-hand inventory value, which, for example, in this case is 300 units, and assign a priority as that value as a percent of the maximum. So 300 units is 30% of 1,000. So the assigned priority value, if we're using this method, is going to be 30. If my on-hand inventory was 100 units, then that would be 10% of my maximum inventory, which would be a higher priority. What this method allows us to do is to proportionally prioritize fulfillment to warehouses where the inventory is closer to being stocked out. So when I have a different maximum quantity at different warehouses, instead of just looking at a discrete amount of inventory that's on hand, I can look at that inventory as a percentage of my target on-hand inventory. Now let's go back through our original scenario and look at how the percent of maximum inventory will calculate priorities and how master planning will then tell us to allocate our inventory. So in this scenario, where we have our warehouse 11 and warehouse 12, which have a minimum maximum and reorder point. For warehouse 11, we have 450 units on hand out of the 1,000 maximum. So we will get a transfer requirement for a quantity of 550 to take us back up to the maximum and a priority of 45. Just a reminder again that we will not trigger a transfer requirement with priority-based planning unless the projected on-hand inventory is below the reorder point. So if my inventory in this case was, 600 units on hand, that's above my reorder point of 500, so I wouldn't get a master planning signal to do a transfer. For warehouse 12, I have 120 units on hand, which is 12% of my maximum inventory, and I need 880 units to replenish that warehouse. So I get a transfer quantity of 880 with a priority of 12. Based on my sales order default priority, I'm going to get a requirement to allocate 100 units with a priority of 5. Sales order line priority will be assigned by the planning priority model as a default, as will those other order types like a demand forecast. This is something that is overridable on specific sales lines as well. So we can manually determine that one sales order is more important than another by going in and overriding what has been assigned by the system. My demand forecast has been assigned a default priority of 60. So I'll have a requirement to allocate 100 to my demand forecast with a priority of 60. So now that we have calculated what the quantities and priorities will be for my different requirements, the way that priority-based planning will work is it will allocate inventory starting with the highest priority order, instead of, again, traditional master planning, which will allocate inventory according to date. So in this case, the system will allocate 100 units to my sales order because priority 5 is the highest priority that I have out of all my demand. Then, with the 550 units that we have remaining, the next highest priority order would be my replenishment of warehouse 12 because it has a priority of 12. Unfortunately, I don't have sufficient inventory to fulfill that requirement. So I will get a delay message from master planning until I can receive enough inventory to fulfill that entire warehouse. Because I can't fulfill the next highest priority, I won't be able to fulfill either of my other orders as well. So let's take a look at the net requirements in this scenario and what the output of master planning would look like. So I've used this PBP 001 item to reflect my percent priority coverage, and we'll go look at the net requirements to see what master planning shows us. So in this case, when we look at warehouse 13, we can see that planning priority is a field that has been added to my requirements and my supply as part of this new functionality, and that the values have been assigned based on the setups that I've done. We have our on-hand inventory of 650 units, which again gets a planning priority of 0. We have our sales order for quantity of 100, which gets a planning priority of 5. Because that's the highest priority, we can see that we will be able to meet the requirement date on that. We will allocate our inventory to that. We have our demand forecast and our 2 transfer requirements, which have the corresponding priorities that have been calculated by the system. Because I don't have enough inventory on hand and my lead time says I won't be able to receive it until 11/24, I'm getting a message that I need to delay these 3 orders until then. The difference here between priority-based planning and traditional master planning is, as a planner with traditional planning, I could recognize that I still have 550 inventory units that I could allocate, but I have to decide for myself where they're going to go. In this case, I have the planning priorities assigned based on my business rules that we've configured in the system, and I could, for example, make the decision to allocate 550 units to this transfer requirement now manually, and then replenish the additional 330 once my planned purchase order arrives. And typically when you run master planning, we would expect that different scenarios can show up. So it's not necessarily true that we won't be able to fulfill all but one of our orders, right? I've just specifically chosen a scenario where we really don't have enough inventory and we have some dire need to get it to multiple places. So that is how percent of maximum inventory works as a priority calculation method. The next method that we're going to talk about are inventory priority ranges, where our percent of maximum inventory takes the projected on hand and divides that by the maximum quantity to assign a priority. Instead, we have the option to define ranges of priorities, and wherever that projected on hand falls within a range, it will be assigned the priority value for that range. In this case, I have defined my ranges as being 0 or less gets a priority of 1. From my 0 to my minimum gets a priority of 30. From my minimum to my reorder gets a priority of 50. And from my reorder to my maximum gets a priority of 70. The numbers that I assigned to each of these ranges were decided by me. The ranges that I've decided, I kept them very simple, but when we set up our planning priority models, we can add additional ranges. For example, I could split between my minimum and my reorder point. I could determine that I want a range that's minimum to 50% of my minimum, and then 50% of my minimum to the reorder point. Have those be 2 different ranges with 2 different priority values. But for the sake of this demo, I've kept it simple. So in this case, when we have a projected on hand of 300, that lands in this orange range and gets assigned a priority of 50 for replenishment. If I had 100 on hand, that would fall into this red range and get a priority of 30. So instead of being on a sliding scale with a percent of maximum, we've broken our prioritization into buckets, and wherever we fall in that bucket, we will get that priority value assigned. Now let's look at what happens in our main scenario when we use this priority range setup to determine the priority for our demand. So in this case, 450 units on hand falls into that orange bucket. So we'll get a transfer requirement of 550 with a priority of 50. In warehouse 12, 120 units on hand is between 0 and our minimum. So we'll get a transfer quantity of 880 with a priority of 30. Our sales order gets a priority of 5 again, and our demand forecast gets a priority of 60. So in this case, again, I will allocate first to my sales order because it's the highest priority, and then I will once again be short for the next highest priority order, which is my warehouse 12 replenishment. Let's go take a look at what the net requirements look like when this is our method. So in the net requirements, we can see once again, my priorities have been calculated for me by the system, and I'm getting a message that I can only fulfill this sales order. I can't fulfill the next highest priority, which is this transfer for 880, until the rest of my planned purchase order comes in. Again, as a planner, I now have visibility into what the priority of different demand is, and I could manually choose to allocate my remaining on-hand inventory to get something over to this warehouse immediately. So it's the system is both now using priority to automatically allocate inventory and exposing the priority to me as a planner so I can determine where I want to manually allocate inventory if necessary. So that is priority ranges using the order strategy of single supply with the highest demand. The next level of detail that we can add with priority ranges is the ability to split orders based on the priority range. So just like we have the priority ranges with single supply, we have our same priority ranges again, but this time with the strategy of split by priority range for planned orders, I will get multiple orders for the same warehouse. So in this example, my projected on hand is 300 units, and that falls into my priority range of 50. But with splitting, I will get a requirement of 200 units, which will take me up to my reorder point of 500, and that gets priority of 50. I will then get a second requirement, which is from my reorder point to my maximum for a quantity of 500 and a priority of 70. So what this is allowing us to do is break the quantity that belongs in each priority range into its own requirement and use the priority range's priority value to drive the priority for that chunk of inventory. Now, this is a really interesting scenario to use, especially when we put it in the context of that same business scenario we've been referring to this whole time. So now when we look at warehouse 11, we have 450 units on hand, which means I will first get a transfer requirement for a quantity of 50 and a priority of 50. And that's for the chunk of inventory that gets me up to my reorder point in the system. I'll get a second transfer requirement with a quantity of 500 and a priority of 70, which will bring me ultimately back up to my maximum. For warehouse 12, I'll have a transfer quantity of 80 with priority 30, which gets me up to my minimum. I'll have a transfer quantity of 300 with a priority of 50, which gets me up to my reorder point, and a transfer quantity of 500 with a priority of 70, which gets me up to my maximum. My sales order still gets a priority of 5, and my demand forecast still gets a priority of 60. Now, this time, using priority ranges with splitting, what master planning will do to allocate the inventory when I run it is, first, it will take my inventory and allocate to the sales order. That's 100 units there. Then we'll take inventory and allocate it to my transfer requirement with a priority of 30. Then we'll go to the 2 transfer requirements with priority of 50, then to the demand forecast of 60. And then if we had inventory left over, then we would go to the 70. What this looks like in this scenario, let's go look at the net requirements. When I use this method to apply priority to my different requirements, I actually see that I can fulfill more of my replenishments, or partially fulfill more of my replenishments, and in a way that still reflects the priority that I have for my warehouse fulfillment. So in this particular case, we see that we will be able to fulfill our sales order requirement on its date with 100 units. We'll be able to fill our 3 transfer requirements, the one with 30 priority and the 2 with 50. And we'll be able to fulfill our demand forecast. So that's 5 of our 6 or 7 requirements that will be able to be fulfilled on the requirement date, because I've decided to split my replenishments into the priority range buckets. I then will be able to place my purchase order, receive that on the 24th, and on that day, complete the replenishment of my warehouses to the maximum. So this is a different way that we can approach priority-based planning and apply our inventory across different sources of demand. Now let's talk about a couple notes to keep in mind if you're going to test or implement this functionality. You'll notice that we did not talk about production orders in this Tech Talk. That is not functionality that's available with the preview that's currently out to be used, but it is something that's on the roadmap, so it'll be coming. And this feature that's been released is only compatible with planning optimization, not with traditional master planning. If you have an item that is set up with a coverage code priority and you're running traditional master planning, it will be treated as if you have a coverage type of requirement. So you have to adopt planning optimization in order for this functionality to work. And in case you're interested, there is a very thorough priority-based planning Microsoft doc out there that I linked in this PowerPoint, which will be available after this Tech Talk has been uploaded. There was an MRP Basics Tech Talk done by Sachin Gandhi in 2019 that covers the basics of traditional master planning, which is really helpful if you're looking for any background on that. And Christian Ritt did a planning optimization Tech Talk earlier this year if you're curious about that or have any questions. With that, I have completed my presentation. Let's move it over to the Q&A. Zach, are there any questions that were asked throughout this presentation that we should talk through?
Yeah, there's a few. Anne, first one is, what happens if we have two orders with the same priority, but we don't have enough on hand for both?
I believe in that case, you would have to decide manually which to allocate to.
Yeah, I can chip in on that one. This is Christian here. So in that case, basically what we're doing, we are looking first at the priority, and then the next thing, that's the date. So if they don't have the same date, then we will use the date as the second parameter.
And if they have the same date?
Then it's first come, first served. Then it's basically what it hits first, similar to current MRP.
Thank you. Any other questions, Zach?
I mean, we have a few different versions of this question and around, is a priority for sales orders always a default value, or it can be calculated based on something like, customer group, or other things based on the sales order? Is there anything that we have to sort of, group our sales orders in terms of priorities?
Yeah, and I can take that one as well. So right now, our defaulting story is just for, you could say, the order type, where sales orders would be one combined order type. So you would have one default value there. It is something we are aware, and we're looking into to see how much additional benefit we can get from having a more rich defaulting setup. But that said, it is perfectly fine to modify it. It does default something, but as soon as you have your order created, you can always go in and ensure that a special sales order get priority over another by changing the planning priority. But we are aware of the ask.
Great. Okay, and I mean, a similar question around, can priorities be defined by warehouse? Like, could we have a warehouse that or sales channel that has a higher or lower priority?
So you could say whenever, I'll just keep answering here. Sorry for that. So when we talk about by warehouse, you could say whenever we calculate the supply for a warehouse, as Anne was explaining, we actually set the priority. We calculate that. So that would be done automatically by warehouse, obviously, and also by product. But it's not like you can say that if one order is created for one warehouse, like if you manually go in and create an order for, related to one warehouse over another warehouse, you cannot control the defaulting. But it is calculated by warehouse. Absolutely, yes.
And you could, from a replenishment perspective, you could set up the item coverage on one warehouse to use a different coverage group with a different planning priority model. So you could have a different set of ranges with higher priority values if you wanted to prioritize replenishment of one warehouse over another, right?
Absolutely. Good point, Anne.
Okay, great. Thank you both very much. One more came in. Does order type priority always override the priorities determined for the inventory?
So I guess this question is around does order type priority always override the priority determined for the inventory? I assume that this is how do we basically figure out if we're using priority. That's how I hear it. So basically we are using the normal setup that we have for master planning. So you can either set it up on your coverage group or on the individual item coverage, and the more specific you get, that's what we're taking. If that answers the question, if not, please rephrase, or if anyone understood it otherwise, chip in.
Maybe, Christian, it makes sense let's go back to a planning priority model and just talk about the hierarchy, because we do have those. For example, we have a transfer order default and a purchase order default, but none of my requirements came out using those, right? Because we have for transfer orders and purchase orders, if we're using priority ranges, then that supersedes the default down here, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So the defaults, that's only relevant for manually created orders, not planned orders.
So if I make a manual purchase order, then the default value for all my lines will be 50 instead of a calculation that comes from the priority ranges or the % of maximum inventory.
Correct, because it's not directly tied to a demand.
Right. And then consider demand priority will supersede the planning priority ranges or % of maximum inventory, or what's the hierarchy there, Christian?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Anne? Sorry,
so when we enable, so only for priority ranges, when we can enable consider demand priority, then when our supply order is created, the planning priority, so the range would calculate what the priority is, but if your supply that it's pegged to, or your demand that is pegged to that supply has a higher priority, then the supply order would get a priority that matches the demand.
Correct. And yeah, so it's close to where your point is right now, where we have the consider the demand priority. And if you have this enabled, then basically what the calculation would do, it will say that you cannot have a lower priority value, so it cannot be more important than the original demand. And this is basically to avoid too much bullwhip effect throughout the system. You could imagine you had a forecast line with a priority 90, so very low priority or importance at least, which then rippled down the system, and due to some low inventory levels, it could end up as a priority 1 lower in the system. But if you have this check mark throughout the system, then it will keep the 90 on the components needed for this, or the transfers or what have you.
Thanks for that clarification.
And I could see another one coming in. Can I prioritize e-commerce orders over EDI orders? So different orders. So we have also added the planning priority to the data entity, so you can absolutely override it whenever you create an order. You can define what you want your priority to be. So you can just specify that.
Great. And then, Christian, I don't know if you just saw this one, but is it at the sales header or the sales line that you can apply this priority?
It's on the line.
It is on the line.
Yeah, just a kind of side note, I think this will be really interesting when it comes to production planning, because your raw materials could be used in different finished goods, right? So if we have different planning priority defaults by item, and those are produced items, then we can use that to drive the allocation of raw materials to the more important production orders and sales orders.
Yep. Yeah, and good point, Anna, on that as well, because support for production, we don't have that as of now, but it is actually developed and checked in, and it's being shipped as part of the GA version. So I believe it's 10.024. That version is coming out, and GA will also include the production support.
Awesome.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you. And that concludes our presentation. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any additional questions or feedback. With that, I'll hand it back to you, David.
Thank you, Anne. I have posted a short survey in the Q&A panel. We'd like your feedback on today's session and hear what you'd like to see in future events. Thanks for your participation. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the TechTalk's Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and audience for joining us today.